They say some names refuse to die, and in the Louisiana bayou, one name still echoes through the mist: Gabriel, the slave who killed his overseer and vanished into the swamp, only to return as the curse that burned his master's world to ash. For nearly 2 centuries, his story has haunted the cane fields and riverbanks, whispered by those who claim to have seen his shadow when thunder rolls. Tonight, we uncover the legend that would not fade, the man who became vengeance itself, and the truth buried beneath Belle Rive's scorched earth. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from tonight, because some stories stretch farther than time, carried by blood, fire, and memory. Now, let's return to the bayou, where the chains still sing beneath the water, and the name Gabriel still burns in the dark. Long after the Civil War ended, when the sound of chains had faded but the soil still bled memory, the Louisiana bayou whispered a name the living refused to speak aloud: Gabriel. To the locals, he was not a ghost, not entirely. He was a reminder, a legend shaped by violence, fear, and the unbearable silence that followed one act of impossible defiance. They said he was the slave who killed the overseer and vanished into the swamp, and that the land itself had kept his secret. The story begins in a place where the air never cools, where the cypress roots twist like bones beneath green water, and the sound of frogs and crickets hides the cries of the past. The swamp remembers everything, every lash, every prayer, every drop of blood it was forced to swallow. When night falls, it breathes, heavy and damp, carrying stories that history tried to drown. The legend of Gabriel was not written in any courthouse record. It survived in fragments: a blood-stained axe unearthed in a collapsed sugar mill, a missing plantation ledger with pages torn clean, a name carved into the wood of a burned chapel: Gabriel. These were not proofs but traces, enough to make the historians argue and the locals tremble. To some, he was a man who fled justice. To others, he was justice itself, finally taking form. In 1869, a former field hand named Sarah Holt told a traveling reporter that she had once seen him. She said Gabriel came to her door during the last months of the war, barefoot and silent, his eyes bright as fireflies in the dark. She claimed he asked for water and left her with a warning: "Tell them the swamp keeps what it loves." Her story was dismissed as the delusion of an old woman, but after her death, her house sank overnight into the marsh. Belle Rive Plantation, where the legend began, no longer exists. The cane fields are gone, the main house reduced to stone and ivy. Only the sugar mill chimney stands like a tombstone for what once was. Yet locals still avoid the area after dark. They say the frogs go quiet near the old property, as if something still listens. Fishermen refuse to anchor their boats near the sunken levee, and children dare one another to call his name 3 times into the fog. None of them finish. To understand who Gabriel was, one must understand the world that created him, a world of property and punishment, of men who ruled by cruelty and scripture, and of one man who finally refused to kneel. His story begins not with his birth, but with his breaking the moment a human being became a myth. Tonight, we return to that world, to the heat and hunger of the Louisiana cane fields, and to the legend that refused to die. Because sometimes, history does not fade, it waits. And in the heart of the swamp, where the air still hums with memory, Gabriel is still waiting. Before Gabriel's name became a whisper in the swamp, it was a curse born inside the grand plantation known as Belle Rive. In the 1840s, it stood as one of the richest sugar estates along the lower Mississippi, a sprawling kingdom carved from river mud and human misery. The main house, with its white columns and iron balconies, shimmered like a jewel from the road. But beneath that polish lay rot, the kind that begins in the soul and spreads to the soil. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore ruled Belle Rive with a soldier's precision and a preacher's certainty. A veteran of older wars, he carried himself as if the Confederacy already existed within his blood. His portrait still hangs in the courthouse museum, eyes painted with the calm of a man who believed himself chosen by God to command. Every acre he owned was measured not in land, but in bodies hundreds of enslaved men and women who harvested the gold that glistened in the fields. Sugar. Sugar was wealth. but it was also death. The cane fields were endless, stretching to the horizon, their green stalks swaying in the humid wind like a congregation forced to bow. Cutting season began before dawn and ended after sunset. The air was thick with ash from the mills, coating everything in a gray haze that stung the throat and burned the eyes. To breathe at Belle Rive was to taste the price of luxury. It was here that the hierarchy of power stood sharper than any blade. At the top was Wildermore, beneath him the overseer, and below them the enslaved, their names recorded not as people, but as numbers on parchment. Overseer Travis Crow was the enforcer of that order. Tall, sun-browned, and always carrying a riding crop, he was the kind of man who mistook fear for respect. The slaves called him the Crow, not for his name, but for the way he seemed to appear wherever suffering nested. Crow believed in omens. He nailed horseshoes above the whipping post, burned herbs before punishment, and carried a pouch of teeth he claimed belonged to runaways. Some said he feared the devil. Others said he was trying to bargain with him. His power was absolute, sanctioned by a master who saw cruelty as efficiency. Every cry, every scar, every body buried beneath the cane roots was part of the price of keeping Belle Rive alive. At night, the mill fires never went out. The black smoke rose into the stars, mingling with the mist of the bayou until the sky itself seemed to carry the weight of human suffering. Yet, beneath that smoke, something else began to stir, quiet, unseen, and patient. Among the enslaved, whispers took shape, soft as breath but heavy with promise. They spoke of justice, of reckoning, and of a man who would rise from the ashes of Belle Rive's cruelty. That man's name was not yet legend, but the fields had already chosen him. And in the house of ash and sugar, where wealth was built on pain, the story of Gabriel was preparing to ignite. They said the night Gabriel was born, the sky itself broke open. Lightning struck so close to the slave quarters that the earth caught fire, and rain poured down hard enough to drown the flames. The midwives called it an omen, the overseer called it nonsense. But to the men and women who bent their backs beneath the cane of Belle Rive, that night became the beginning of a story they would whisper for generations, the birth of the child they called the Iron-born. Gabriel grew into a man shaped by work and weather. His shoulders were broad enough to cast shadows across the field rows, his hands rough as the bark of the cypress trees. His skin carried the raised map of survival, a lattice of scars from lashes, burns, and the iron brand pressed into his chest the year he tried to save another man from punishment. The mark never healed smooth. It remained swollen and red even years later, pulsing faintly when he worked beneath the sun. Some said it glowed during storms, others swore they saw it spark. He was not like the others, not in the way he moved, not in the way silence seemed to follow him. While others sang to survive the rhythm of the cane knives, Gabriel worked in quiet concentration, each swing deliberate and steady. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. The overseers mistook his silence for obedience. The enslaved knew better. In his stillness was a kind of defiance that could not be whipped out of him. Travis Crow, the overseer, saw that strength as a challenge. He tested it often, ordering Gabriel to move wagons others couldn't, to carry loads no man should bear alone. And Gabriel did, without complaint, his eyes calm, his breath slow. The other men whispered that the storm had left something inside him, that the iron which branded his flesh had fused with his bones. Some began to believe he could not be killed by ordinary means. But even legends bleed. Those closest to Gabriel saw the toll that silence took. They noticed the way he lingered by the river after work, staring into the black water as if listening to something beneath it. They heard him whisper the names of the dead, names the masters had forgotten, names buried beneath the cane fields. Among the enslaved, Gabriel became both hope and warning. Hope, because he reminded them that strength could survive beneath chains. Warning, because everyone who stood tall too long at Belle Rive eventually fell. Yet, when storms rolled in from the Gulf and lightning flashed across the swamp, the others would look to the sky and say that the Iron-born was listening. No one knew then that the same power that made him endure would soon make him dangerous not only to his masters, but to the world that believed men like him were born only to serve. The legend of Gabriel did not begin with rebellion. It began with restraint, with the quiet endurance of a man who had already learned that storms, once awakened, never truly sleep. The sugar fields of Belle Rive stretched endlessly beneath the Louisiana sun, a green ocean that shimmered with heat and sorrow. Every morning before dawn the bells rang from the mill tower, calling the enslaved from their shacks to the rows. The air was already thick, the ground soft from night rain, and the sound of machetes striking cane would soon become the rhythm of the day. By sunrise, the fields pulsed with life and exhaustion, hundreds of bodies moving in unison, each cut releasing the sweet scent of sugar and the bitter sting of labor. The work was unrelenting. The men swung blades until their palms split open. The women bundled the stalks and carried them to the carts, their backs slick with sweat, their feet sinking into the mud. The overseers rode horseback along the rows, watching with cold eyes, the crack of their whips echoing across the land like punctuation marks in a sermon no one wanted to hear. Those who faltered were punished, not for slowing the harvest, but for reminding the others what defiance looked like. And yet, even in that cruelty, life persisted. They sang to mark time, to keep breath moving through their bodies when strength began to fail. The songs rose from the fields like prayers, simple and rhythmic, the only language that could not be owned. The overseers heard only noise. The enslaved heard messages hidden between the verses, coded warnings, hopes and memories carried from one generation to the next. It was through those songs that the first whispers began, soft, uncertain, carried between the rows with the wind. They spoke of freedom, of vengeance, of a reckoning that would come when the fields least expected it, and every whisper, no matter where it began, ended with the same name, Gabriel, the iron-born, the one who never cried out under the lash, the man whose silence frightened even the cruelest overseer. Some said he had strength enough to lift a wagon with his bare hands. Others said the lightning that struck on the night of his birth had marked him for something greater. In a world that erased names, his survived because it could not be silenced. The whispers were not rebellion yet, not even hope. They were survival disguised as rumor. Speaking openly meant death. But believing, even quietly, meant life. At night, when the moonlight silvered the cane and the air cooled enough for breath to slow, small groups gathered in secret. They shared stories of men who had fled north, of revolts in other parishes, of masters who vanished in the swamp and were never found. And always, someone would ask if Gabriel was listening. The answer came not in words, but in the rustle of the cane, the low hum of frogs in the bayou, and the pulse of the land itself, as if the fields had begun to remember what fear had once made them forget. The legend was growing, taking root in the same soil that fed the master's wealth. Belle Rive was still a kingdom of sugar, but beneath the sweetness, something dangerous had begun to stir. Travis Crow ruled the fields of Belle Rive with the precision of a clockmaker and the cruelty of a man who believed pain was proof of power. His word was law, his whip the scripture that enforced it. To the enslaved, he was more than a man. He was the storm that came every day, predictable and merciless. The plantation ran on his rhythm, and every lash, every command, was part of his ritual. But behind that ritual lay something darker, a game that only he understood. Crow's obsession began with control. He believed that breaking a man's body was not enough. He wanted to break their spirit, to make them kneel not just from pain but from surrender. The other overseers admired his efficiency. The slaves learned to fear the sound of his boots before they saw his face. Yet among them was one man he could not break, Gabriel. Gabriel's silence was an insult Crow could not forgive. While others cried out, begged, or cursed, Gabriel endured punishment as if his body belonged to someone else. When the whip fell, he did not shout. When forced to work beyond exhaustion, he did not slow. His strength was not the kind Crow could measure, and that made him dangerous. At first, Crow tried humiliation. He ordered Gabriel to perform tasks meant to shame him, cleaning the overseer's quarters, lifting barrels alone that usually required 3 men, standing watch through the night without food or rest. Yet Gabriel did all of it without a word. The more he obeyed, the more Crow's temper grew. To see power ignored was, to him, a kind of blasphemy. Punishment soon became theater. He made the others watch, gathering them in the yard so they could see what defiance earned. He struck Gabriel with the whip until the leather split, the blood staining the dirt in dark streaks. Still, Gabriel did not cry out. He only looked at Crow with a calm that bordered on contempt. That look was worse than rebellion. It told Crow that his cruelty meant nothing. It was then that the overseer's game changed. Breaking Gabriel was no longer about discipline. It became personal, a contest between man and myth. Crow began inventing new ways to test him, sending him into the swamp to haul wood alone, forcing him to carry scalding barrels from the boiling house, making him stand in the noon sun with iron chains around his neck. He wanted to see him bend. He wanted to see him human. But with every punishment, Gabriel only grew quieter, stronger, more distant. The men whispered that pain no longer reached him. Even Crow began to doubt what he saw. At night, when he looked across the fields, he thought he saw Gabriel standing in the mist, unmoving, eyes glinting faintly like coals. What Travis Crow never understood was that cruelty has a limit, even if endurance does not. Every strike, every humiliation, every ritual of power was not breaking Gabriel, it was forging him. And the man Crow sought to destroy was already becoming something far more dangerous than a slave who refused to kneel. He was becoming a storm waiting for the right moment to strike back. The night began like any other storm in the Louisiana summer, thick with heat and trembling air, the sky bruised with rolling clouds. But by dusk, the fields of Belle Rive had grown unnaturally still, as if the earth itself sensed what was coming. In the center of the cane rows, beneath the rising wind, Gabriel knelt in chains. Iron cuffs locked his wrists and ankles, fastened to a post buried deep in the mud. Rain gathered around him, running through the furrows like veins of silver. Travis Crow had ordered the punishment at noon. He called it defiance. Others called it cruelty. The truth was simpler. The overseer needed to remind everyone who ruled the fields. The order was given with satisfaction, and as the storm built, Crow left Gabriel alone beneath the open sky. The workers returned to their quarters in silence. No one dared to look back, but every heart in the plantation carried the same image: a man bound in darkness, waiting for lightning to strike. The storm came slowly at first, a low rumble across the horizon. Then the heavens split open. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the ground until the rows disappeared beneath shallow water. Wind tore through the cane, bending the stalks as if they were bowing to something unseen. The iron around Gabriel's wrists grew slick and cold. Each flash of light carved his body out of the dark, scarred, trembling, and human, and then returned him to shadow. The people in the cabins prayed for him that night. They prayed for mercy, for silence, for the storm to end. But the storm only grew worse. It raged without pause, striking closer and closer until the air smelled of iron and smoke. Some said they heard a cry rise through the rain, too deep to be pain, too raw to be human. Others said the earth itself answered, shaking as though something old and buried had been awakened. By morning, the storm had passed. The fields were flattened, the cane bent low, and the post where Gabriel had been chained stood empty. The chains lay broken, not at the links, but at the bolts buried in the soil, twisted free, as if pulled by hands stronger than metal. No one saw him leave, no one heard him go. But the ground was scorched in a perfect circle where he had knelt, and the mud carried the scent of lightning. Travis Crow refused to speak of it. The master forbade the others from asking. Yet from that day forward, when thunder rolled across the sky, the enslaved whispered that the storm had answered him. The night of chains had ended, and the man the overseer tried to break was no longer bound by anything human. When the first light touched the fields of Belle Rive, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the birds hesitated to sing. The cane was bent low, flattened in places by the night's fury, and a thin mist clung to the ground, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something darker. By the time the workers stepped from their cabins, the sun was rising over a field that would never again be the same. Near the edge of the sugar mill, they found him. Travis Crow, the overseer who ruled through fear, lay face down in the mud, his body twisted unnaturally, his whip tangled beside him like a dead serpent. His skull had been split clean through, as if struck by a single, deliberate blow. The soil around him was soaked crimson, the blood already darkening in the dawn light. His horse was gone. His pistol was missing. But the most chilling discovery was what lay a few yards away. The chains that had bound Gabriel, snapped and torn from the post that once held him. Word spread across the plantation faster than the morning wind. Men and women stopped in their work, glancing toward the mill, whispering prayers under their breath. No one spoke Gabriel's name aloud, but every mind held it. The iron-born had risen, and the overseer's blood was the proof. Colonel Wildermore arrived before noon, his carriage wheels sinking into the soft ground near the scene. He said little, only ordered the body taken away and the earth covered. But the stain would not disappear. For days after, rainwater pooled in that same spot and turned red, no matter how many times the soil was replaced. The workers began avoiding it entirely, walking wide circles around the place where Travis Crow had fallen, as if the land itself demanded respect for what had been done there. Among the enslaved, fear and awe mixed until they were indistinguishable. Some believed Gabriel had fled into the swamp, carried away by the same storm that freed him. Others swore he had become something else, no longer flesh and blood but a spirit bound to the bayou, avenging every cry that had ever gone unanswered. The elders said that when lightning strikes without thunder, it is him passing by. Belle Reve changed after that morning. The overseer's house stood empty, his whip rusting on the porch. The masters spoke in quiet tones, their confidence shaken. In the quarters, the songs grew softer but heavier, filled with reverence and warning. A man had done the impossible. He had struck down the hand of power and vanished before the world could decide whether he was man or myth. The blood at dawn marked more than the death of one overseer. It marked the birth of a legend. The chains that once held Gabriel had broken, but the story of that morning would bind Belle Reve forever. And though the sun rose as it always had, the light that touched those fields no longer felt like mercy, it felt like judgment. The morning after Travis Crow's body was buried, the air over Belle Reve grew heavy with a new kind of silence, one that spoke of fear wearing the mask of authority. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore, furious and humiliated, declared that order would be restored by force. Gabriel, now branded as a murderer and runaway, had become both a ghost story and a challenge to the master's power. Wildermore could not afford to let the myth grow. He summoned men from the neighboring parishes, promised gold for Gabriel's capture, and ordered the swamp searched until the fugitive was found, or the bayou itself was drained. By dawn, the hunt began. Bloodhounds were brought in from Baton Rouge, their handlers boasting of their ability to track anything that bled or breathed. Armed men, deputies, planters' sons, and bounty hunters, hardened by years of violence, rode out toward the wetlands, their boots splashing through the shallow water. They followed the trail of mud and crushed cane leading from the mill toward the deep heart of the bayou. But the swamp was not a place for men like them. It swallowed sound, twisted direction, and turned courage into confusion. The cypress trees grew close, their roots rising from the water like the ribs of a buried creature. Mosquitoes clouded the air, and the smell of rot and decay thickened with each step. By the second day, men began to whisper that they were not alone. They found footprints that appeared, then vanished in places no human could walk. They heard chains rattling somewhere beyond sight, and voices calling their names from the mist. The first party returned, missing one man. The second returned with two. The third never returned at all. Horses were found wandering days later, their saddles slashed, and their eyes wide with terror. A deputy from Street Helena Parish swore he saw a figure standing waist-deep in the black water at night, motionless, its eyes reflecting the firelight. He fired twice. When the smoke cleared, the figure was gone, and the water around him rippled red. Within a week, the hunters had become the hunted. Men refused to enter the swamp after sunset. The bloodhounds stopped barking and refused to pull their leashes forward. Even the bravest among them began to believe what they would not say aloud, that something was moving through those woods with purpose, something that knew the land better than they ever could. Colonel Wildermore tried to hold his command together, but fear travels faster than orders. The men muttered that the Ironborn could not die, that the storm had claimed him as its own. Some said the swamp had turned against its masters, that it had chosen Gabriel as its instrument. Whatever truth lay behind the stories, one thing became certain. The more they searched, the less they found. By the end of the second week, the colonel called off the hunt. Too many men had vanished. Too much gold had been wasted. The swamp returned to its stillness. But the legend had only grown. And when the night wind moved across the river and rustled the cane, those who listened swore they could hear the chains not of captivity, but of vengeance, dragging softly through the water. In the summer of 1854, the first written record of the Gabriel legend appeared, not in a newspaper or a courthouse, but in the weathered journal of a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Bell. He was a circuit minister, one of many who rode the river routes, preaching repentance to towns that smelled of sugar and sweat. His task was to bring salvation to a land that no longer believed in mercy. What he found instead was fear, a fear so deep that even the faithful refused to name it aloud. Reverend Bell first heard the stories in Street Helena Parish. The people spoke of strange lights flickering in the swamps at night, of trees that bled when cut, and of a figure seen standing among the cypress roots, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. Some said it was the spirit of a runaway slave seeking vengeance on his captors. Others claimed it was something older, a manifestation of the land itself. The preacher dismissed it at first as superstition, the usual whispers born from guilt and isolation. But curiosity, or perhaps divine unease, drew him closer. He began writing down what he heard. His entries grew more frantic as the days passed. In one, he described standing on the edge of the swamp after sunset and hearing what he called the voice of chains moving through water, yet no man in sight. In another, he wrote of phantom fires glowing deep within the bayou, blue and cold, floating just above the ground like the wisps. He claimed to see shapes moving between the trees, shapes that vanished when he called out scripture. The most haunting passage came from his final entry. He wrote of a night so quiet that even the frogs refused to sing. In that silence, he heard breathing slow, steady, impossibly close. When he turned, he saw what he later described as a shadow with a man's heart and a beast's rage, standing where no shadow should. The thing did not move, did not speak. It simply watched him until he dropped to his knees and prayed until dawn. Reverend Bell left the parish the next morning and never returned. His horse was found at the ferry landing, still saddled but riderless. Days later, a ferryman discovered the preacher's satchel floating downriver. Inside was his Bible, waterlogged but intact, and the journal that would later be known as the Bell Testament. Historians have long debated its authenticity. Skeptics call it the product of delirium, the fevered imagination of a man who spent too many nights in the swamps. But those who live near the ruins of Bell Rive believe otherwise. To them, the preacher did not invent the legend, he recorded its first witness. His words became the earliest surviving testimony that Gabriel had not only lived, but that something far greater had begun to move through the bayou. A force neither divine nor human, born from suffering and thunder, that would haunt Louisiana's river country for generations to come. In the deep heart of Louisiana, the line between earth and water is a matter of faith. The swamp is not a place one enters. It is a living thing that allows entry only to those it chooses. For generations, men believed they ruled the land, that boundaries could be marked with fences and maps. But the swamp has no master. It breathes, it remembers, and it keeps what it loves. After Gabriel's escape, it began to choose. The hunters who went in after him never understood that the swamp was not just terrain, it was a witness. Its silence was not absence. It was judgment. The water carried secrets in its slow current, and the roots of the cypress trees twisted like fingers ready to drag the uninvited below. The men who sought Gabriel entered with rifles and dogs, but they were intruding upon something ancient, older than the plantations, and older than the men who built them. Within days, the swamp began to take them. Some disappeared into quicksand, their screams swallowed before the others could reach them. Others were found fevered and blind, their skin covered in boils, babbling about shadows that moved like smoke. One man returned with both his legs broken, claiming he had fallen after something whispered his name from the trees. He died before morning, and the dogs that survived refused to go near his body. Word spread quickly through the parishes. Locals began to say that the swamp had turned against white men, that it had taken sides. They called it retribution, the earth reclaiming what centuries of cruelty had stolen. Stories grew of lights seen in the mist, of footprints that appeared in the mud only to vanish beneath water that did not ripple. Some said Gabriel had called upon the spirits of the enslaved dead, and that their souls now walked with him, guiding him through the labyrinth of roots and fog. Colonel Wildermore sent more men, each with torches and maps, each certain they would succeed where others had failed. None returned whole. Some went mad, wandering into the cane fields, raving about songs that rose from beneath the water. The few who stumbled back to civilization spoke of hearing chains dragging behind them, though their own feet were bare. By the end of that season, no one entered the swamp willingly. Even the bravest hunters kept their distance, muttering prayers when thunder rolled from the east. They said the land had made its choice, the swamp had adopted its fugitive. In the heart of that drowned wilderness, Gabriel was no longer a man hiding from his masters. He was part of the living earth itself, a legend the swamp refused to give back. And so, the story began to change. People stopped asking when he would be caught, and started asking when the swamp would release him. It never did. For in the bayou, where the air is thick with history and the ground trembles with memory, not every man who dies is buried, some are simply claimed. By the time summer reached Belle Rive, the plantation had become a place of whispers and hollow eyes. The fields still swayed under the heat, and the sugar still boiled in the great iron vats. But the rhythm that once filled the air, the hum of voices, the rise of songs was gone. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore had replaced it with something colder. Silence. It was his new law, his desperate answer to the fear that Gabriel had left behind. The colonel's world was unraveling. The overseer lay buried, his killers never found. The men he sent into the swamps had vanished, and every night the wind seemed to carry the sound of chains moving through the trees. Wildermore could not explain it, but he could feel it, a presence circling his empire like a wolf around wounded prey. And so, he did what desperate men of power always do when control slips through their fingers. He tightened his grip. The first order came quietly, no singing in the fields. The hymns and work songs that had once carried through the cane rows were now forbidden. He said they invited rebellion. But the truth was simpler. The songs reminded him that life continued without his permission. He could not bear it. The second order forbade prayer gatherings in the quarters. The slaves had long found comfort in their nightly meetings, whispering verses by candlelight, but Wildermore now saw in every bowed head the spark of conspiracy. Punishment returned to Belle Rive with renewed cruelty. Anyone caught speaking Gabriel's name was whipped. Those who were overheard praying for him were locked in the smokehouse without food or air. The colonel's paranoia grew like rot inside the walls of his mansion. He began sleeping with a pistol beside his bed, waking at every crack of thunder. His wife, Eveline, wrote in her diary that he paced the halls at night, muttering that the swamp was watching him. Servants claimed he burned the old plantation ledgers, as if destroying the records could erase the blood that stained them. Without songs, without prayer, Belle Rive changed. The air itself seemed heavier. The workers moved like shadows, their faces blank, their eyes lowered. Even the cane began to wither in patches, as though the land was responding to the silence that had been forced upon it. The fields no longer hummed with life but groaned beneath the weight of superstition. The enslaved whispered in secret that the master's cruelty had cursed the soil, that every lash now sowed sickness instead of sugar. The colonel refused to hear it. He spoke of order, of discipline, of restoring the old glory of Bel Rive. But his power was an illusion, fragile as the cane stalks he depended upon. The more he silenced his people, the louder the swamp became. The nights grew longer, the mist thicker, the cries of animals sharper and closer. Some swore they saw lights moving between the trees, not lanterns, but flames that drifted and vanished before the eye could follow. Others said they heard footsteps near the veranda after midnight, heavy and deliberate, as though someone familiar had returned. Wildermore's empire was crumbling from within, poisoned not by rebellion but by dread. The slaves obeyed, but their silence carried more power than their voices ever had. It was the silence of mourning, of patience, of waiting for something inevitable. Bel Rive still stood, but its foundations were cracking, eaten away by fear. The colonel had buried Gabriel's name, but he could not bury what that name had awakened. And in the stillness he created, that name began to echo not in words, but in the restless heart of the land itself. By late autumn, Bel Rive had become a graveyard of its own making. The colonel's orders still echoed through the quarters, but the power behind his voice had withered. The overseer was gone. The fields no longer yielded as they once did, and the air hung thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The silence he had forced upon the enslaved had turned inward, hollowing out the plantation until even the birds seemed afraid to sing above it. But nature has a way of restoring balance, and what cruelty suppressed would soon find a voice again. It began with smoke. At first, faint plumes rose from the far edges of the property, small fires burning among the cane rows. The workers whispered that lightning had struck again, though the skies had been clear. The flames spread unnaturally fast, leaping from one field to the next, carried not by wind but by purpose. The colonel's men fought to contain it, only to find the fires reigniting where they had just been extinguished. By dawn, the plantation's profits were ash, and the smell of burnt sugar clung to everything. Then came the livestock. The animals were found slaughtered in their pens, their throats cut clean, their blood pooling in the dirt. No tracks were left, no signs of struggle, only the faint impression of chains pressed into the mud near the stables. The colonel's household servants claimed they heard hooves in the night, but none belonging to a living horse. The sound came from somewhere deeper, heavier, echoing through the fog like the march of a ghost. Panic took hold of Bel Rive. The white men spoke of rebellion, the enslaved spoke of retribution. In the middle of the chaos, a rumor spread that someone had seen him. A field hand claimed that while the cane burned, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the flames, tall and motionless, his face hidden in the glow. Another swore she saw the same figure watching from the riverbank as smoke drifted across the water. They said the fire bent around him, never touching his skin. Colonel Wildermore refused to believe it. He told himself it was fear taking form, guilt made visible in the minds of the weak. But the nights grew longer, the fires more frequent, and his own dreams began to betray him. He started waking drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was standing by his window. His wife refused to sleep beside him, saying that his eyes had taken on the same glassy stare as the livestock they buried each morning. The legend had returned to its birthplace. The swamp had released its chosen son, and he had come home to collect what was owed. Whether man or spirit, no one could say. But the message was clear. Bel Rive would answer for its sins. Every chain that once bound him now dragged through the halls of the master's house. Every flame that once forged sugar now purified what remained of cruelty. By the end of that week, the fires stopped as suddenly as they began. The ash cooled, the smoke cleared, and the land fell eerily calm. But the mark was left forever. The walls of the main house were blackened, the portrait of Colonel Wildermore's ancestors reduced to cinders, and the ground beneath the sugar mill was split open like a wound. And though the master swore it was all coincidence, those who survived would tell a different story, that Gabriel had returned, not as a man, but as the reckoning that silence had summoned. By the winter of 1854, The house at Belle Rive had become as haunted as the land it ruled. The fires that swept through the fields had been smothered, yet the smell of smoke lingered in the hallways, seeping from the wood like a memory that refused to die. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore still carried himself like a man of reason, dismissing superstition as weakness, but there was an unease in his eyes that reason could not hide. He had begun to sense that something unseen had crossed the threshold of his home, something patient, deliberate, and vengeful. It was his wife, Eveline, who first spoke of it aloud. She had grown pale and withdrawn, her nights restless, her voice fragile with exhaustion. In her diary, she described the same dream repeating itself for weeks. A man standing by her window, silent and still, the moonlight reflecting off his skin as though it were wet. His eyes glowed faintly, and from his shoulders water dripped onto the floor, mingling with streaks of red that spread like veins through the boards. She said she could smell the swamp on him, that thick, metallic scent of decay and rain. And every night before she woke, the man would raise a hand and place it against the glass, leaving a mark that faded by morning. The servants whispered that the mistress had been touched by madness, but Eveline believed otherwise. In one of her final coherent writings, she confessed that she knew who the apparition was. "Gabriel has returned," she wrote. "He is not here for vengeance alone. He has come to curse our name, to unmake what my husband built from cruelty and sin." Her words were dismissed by the colonel as hysteria born of guilt, a weakness unbecoming of a Wildermore. Yet even he began to notice the chill that filled the house after sundown, the sound of footsteps in the empty halls, and the faint dripping that echoed near his bedroom door when no rain fell outside. The true blow came not to Eveline, but to their son. The boy was 5 years old, the heir to the Wildermore estate, and the colonel's pride. One morning the child woke fevered, his body burning with a heat no water could cool. The doctors were summoned from Baton Rouge, but none could name the sickness. It spread like fire beneath his skin, his breathing shallow, his eyes distant. Eveline insisted the curse had found its mark, that Gabriel had come for the bloodline itself. The colonel silenced her, but when he looked into his son's glassy eyes, he saw his own fear reflected back. At night the boy's fever worsened, and the servants swore they heard whispering in his room, a low voice speaking from the shadows. The mother prayed, the father denied, but the house seemed to pulse with an energy neither could escape. And when the boy finally stilled, his skin cold and his face peaceful, a single muddy footprint appeared beneath the window, pressed deep into the floorboards. No one could explain it. The colonel buried his son at dawn beside the family chapel. The ground sank slightly over the grave within days, as if the earth itself rejected the name carved on the marker. Eveline never recovered. She would spend her remaining nights staring out that same window, waiting for the figure to return, whispering again and again the words that had condemned them all. He killed the overseer and became the master's curse. From that winter forward, Belle Rive was no longer merely haunted by its sins. It was possessed by them, and every drop of blood that carried the Wildermore name would come to bear the weight of what had been spoken in that house, the curse that began not in heaven or hell, but in the swamp that remembers. The Mississippi River has always been more than water. It is a witness, a slow-moving mirror that remembers everything cast into its depths. Along its banks, men built fortunes, buried secrets, and believed that whatever they discarded would be swallowed by the current and forgotten. But rivers do not forget. They keep their dead, their lies, and their confessions, carrying them patiently until the day they choose to resurface. In the spring of 1855, a ferryman named Elijah Poole was working a quiet stretch of water near the street Helena Bend when something drifted toward his boat. At first, he thought it was just another piece of storm debris, a broken crate, a scrap of timber. But as he pulled it from the water, he realized it was a book, swollen with river silt and bound in leather nearly black from age. The initials burned into its cover were faint but still visible. T and C. The ferryman had heard those letters before, whispered by travelers who spoke of Belle Rive and the overseer who had died there. The initials belonged to Travis Crow. Elijah sold the book to a trader who recognized its potential worth, and within months it found its way into the hands of the parish sheriff. From there, it passed quietly between lawyers, ministers, and finally a journalist from New Orleans who transcribed its contents. The pages were nearly ruined, but enough remained to expose a history so vile that even the men who had profited from Bellerive's legacy wished it had stayed beneath the river's surface. Crow's journal began as a record of plantation business dates, punishments, crop yields. But as the entries continued, the tone shifted. The words grew fevered, personal, obsessed. He wrote of the necessity of discipline and the breaking of spirits, describing punishments that went far beyond what any master had ordered. He detailed nights of violence with almost clinical precision, recounting how he measured obedience by the silence that followed each scream. He described the swamp as a place for disposal, writing that the river accepted all things if one gave it enough blood. The most disturbing entries were those written in the final weeks before his death. Crow confessed to dreams that blurred into waking visions of chains clinking in the darkness, of a shadow that followed him from the cane fields to his bed. He began to believe that the storms gathering over Bellerive were alive, that they watched him, judged him. His handwriting grew erratic, his words slanted across the page as though written in panic. The last entry was brief, written the night before his death. The ink was smudged, as if the paper had been soaked by rain or tears. It contained only one sentence. "He will not die a slave. He will return for us all." That line became legend. Some said it was a warning. Others called it a prophecy. The colonel refused to acknowledge it, insisting the journal was a forgery. But its existence could not be undone. The document was hidden, sealed away in the courthouse archives, and for years no one dared to read it aloud. Yet the river remembers. The water that carried that confession downstream still flows past the ruins of Bellerive, past the levees built on bones, past the places where the dead were never given names. And when the current slows near the bend, some say you can still see a dark shape just beneath the surface, moving with the tide, a shadow that waits, patient and silent, for the next secret the river will be asked to keep. By the time spring returned to Louisiana, Bellerive had become a shadow of itself. The mansion still stood with its white columns and sprawling verandas, but its beauty had turned hollow. The windows were shuttered, the fields half-plowed, and the workers had begun to disappear one by one, vanishing into the night without word or trace. Those who remained spoke in whispers, convinced that the land itself had turned against them. And at the heart of this ruin stood Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore, a man devoured by the very empire he had built. In the months after the fires, Wildermore had tried to restore order. He brought in new overseers, hired laborers from neighboring parishes, and offered wages no man of color could refuse. Yet none stayed. The first overseer fell ill within a week, his body consumed by fever so violent that his skin split open at the shoulders. The second drowned in the river under calm water, his body recovered miles downstream with no sign of struggle. By the third, no one would come near the property at all. The colonel's wealth, once envied across the state, now lay dormant beneath a canopy of ash and superstition. Guilt had begun to rot him from the inside. At first, he tried to dismiss the unease as coincidence, the cruel hand of nature, but reason eroded with each passing day. The fields refused to yield. The cane grew brittle and blackened before harvest. The soil, once rich and heavy with promise, hardened into gray dust. He began to believe that the plantation was feeding on itself, that the sweetness of sugar had turned into something poisonous. In his journals, those few that survived the decay of his mind, he wrote that he could taste blood in the cane juice, a metallic tang that no boiling could remove. Servants who stayed reported that the colonel spoke to himself in the halls, muttering about debts that could never be repaid. They heard him pacing the veranda at midnight, calling into the darkness as if negotiating with the unseen. He refused to eat, claiming the food carried the same taste as the soil. One night, his wife found him kneeling in the fields, his hands buried in the dirt, whispering apologies to the earth as if it could hear. By then, Eveline had already lost herself to grief. Her eyes were hollow, her hair streaked white before its time. She no longer prayed for deliverance, only for silence. The slaves who remained told one another that the blood of the overseer had cursed the fields. Every stalk of cane, they said, grew from the soil watered by his death. Each root tangled around his bones. The swamp had claimed Gabriel, but his vengeance had taken root where he once suffered. Belle Rive was no longer a plantation. It was a living monument to sin. The air grew heavier, the nights longer, and the house itself began to decay, paint peeling, wood warping, doors swelling shut as if the structure resisted being entered. Colonel Wildermore's fortune was crumbling, but what truly haunted him was not loss, it was recognition. He began to understand that every acre of his wealth had been purchased with human agony, every brick of his home laid upon unmarked graves. The more he tried to deny it, the louder the land seemed to remind him. In the distance, thunder rolled, though the skies were clear. The cane rustled when there was no wind. And sometimes, when he walked alone past the sugar mill, he swore he could hear a steady rhythm, the sound of chains dragging through the soil, keeping time with his heartbeat. The colonel's bloodline had once promised endurance, but now it carried the weight of a debt that no prayer could absolve. Belle Rive was dying, not from neglect, but from guilt. And though Wildermore still called himself master, every step he took upon that ground told him the truth. The land no longer belonged to him, it belonged to the blood it had swallowed. In the final years before the war, when Louisiana's rivers still ran thick with commerce and cruelty, there were men who made their living chasing ghosts, men who hunted not for justice, but for coin. Among them was one whose name carried through the South like a curse, Elias Crane. The people called him Hollow. No one knew if it was for the sound of his voice, the emptiness in his eyes, or the way every trail he followed seemed to end in a grave. He had been a Confederate scout, a man who could track a footprint through water or find a heartbeat in the dark. When the fighting ended, he did not return to peace. He returned to the trade he knew best, hunting men. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore found him in a tavern upriver, drinking alone with a revolver beside his hand and a bounty poster beneath his glass. The colonel had grown desperate. His fortune had rotted to nothing, his family's name whispered as a curse, and his fields stood blackened and still. The fires had stopped, but their memory lingered like smoke that refused to rise. The local authorities had abandoned him, the parish feared him, and even his servants had begun to flee. Only gold and silence remained, and so he offered both. Hollow Crane accepted without question. The colonel told him only the essentials: a fugitive, strong as a bull, last seen vanishing into the swamps after murdering an overseer. He omitted the rest, the rumors, the blood debt, the whispers of a curse. Crane didn't ask for details. Men like him didn't need stories to kill. He took the colonel's gold, loaded his horse with powder, rope, and steel, and rode toward the wetlands before dawn. Those who saw him leave remembered the look of him. He wore a long black duster, the fabric torn from years of rain and road. His hat was tilted low, his face weathered, and his eyes pale and distant, like two coins left in a shallow grave. They said he carried a chain around his wrist instead of a rosary, and when he prayed, it was not to God, but to the sound of that metal moving against his skin. The people of Street Helena Parish whispered that sending Hollow Crane into the swamp was like sending death to meet death. He had hunted men through forests, marshes, and rivers, but never through the land that had already chosen its side. The bayou was no place for the living to track the dead. Still, he pressed on, cutting through the fog with his torch, the dogs whining behind him. Each night, he wrote brief notes in a small ledger, names of the dead he'd found, pieces of evidence, strange sounds that carried through the cypress trees. By the fourth night, his entries began to falter. He described lights floating across the water, voices calling to him from both near and far, and the sense that something walked parallel to his path, keeping pace without sound. On the seventh day, his words grew desperate. He wrote that he had seen footprints leading away from the riverbank, too large to be human, too deep to belong to any beast. The next line was shorter: "I am being followed." The journal was found months later, water-stained and half-buried beneath a fallen cypress. The horse had returned alone, its saddle soaked with mud, its rider never seen again. Only the chain he carried was discovered, tangled in the roots beside the swamp's edge, rusted and broken at one end. Colonel Wildermore never spoke of the man he had hired. He locked himself inside his study and burned the contract by candlelight. But the whispers persisted that Hollow Crane had met the Ironborn in the bayou, and that the hunter who called himself Death had finally been claimed by something older. From that day forward, the swamp grew quieter, as if it had taken what it was owed. The legend deepened, and the story of Gabriel, the slave who killed the overseer, had gained another chapter, the one where even the hunter's bones would not float. The swamp did not begin, it simply was. It stretched endlessly across the Louisiana lowlands, a labyrinth of black water, rotting trees, and whispers that seemed to breathe with the mist. It was a place where light went to die, and sound moved slowly, where the difference between a shadow and a man could never be trusted. It was into this world that Elias Hollow Crane and his men rode, carrying torches that flickered like the last heartbeat of reason. They entered believing they were the hunters. They did not understand that the swamp had already chosen its prey. At first, the journey was manageable. The men laughed quietly among themselves, their boots sinking into the soft earth, their rifles steady across their backs. They followed old slave trails that wound through the cypress roots, the dogs sniffing along the path where the scent of man and mud merged into one. The deeper they went, the more the air changed thicker, heavier, alive. The buzzing of insects became a constant hum, drowning out the sound of their own footsteps. Even the bravest among them began to feel the weight of the place pressing in from all sides. The first sign that something was wrong came with the smell. It was not the usual rot of the bayou, but something sharper, metallic, almost human. The dogs grew restless, whining and pulling against their leashes. The water rippled where nothing moved, and every splash seemed to echo longer than it should. By nightfall, the men built a small campfire near a stand of cypress trees. The flames hissed in the damp air, barely holding against the darkness. Around them, the swamp pulsed with sound, frogs croaking, owls calling, branches snapping where no wind stirred. Crane sat apart from the others, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. He had tracked countless men, through deserts, cities, and battlefields, but this was different. The swamp seemed to breathe around him, aware of his presence, judging him for every soul he had dragged back in chains. His men grew uneasy. They whispered that they were being followed, that something moved between the trees but left no trail. When one of them swore he saw eyes glinting just beyond the firelight, Crane dismissed it as nerves. But when morning came, one of the hunters was gone. They found his rifle upright in the mud, his bedroll undisturbed. No blood, no struggle, only footprints that led into the water and stopped where the earth gave way. The dogs refused to follow. By noon, a second man vanished, his body never found, though his hat was discovered hanging from a branch 20 feet above the ground. The swamp was growing louder, its sounds now indistinguishable from human murmurs. The men spoke less, their voices cracking under the weight of fear. On the fourth night, the fire would not light. The torches went out one by one, their flames smothered by unseen hands. The men gathered close, listening to the insects fall silent. The frogs stopped singing, the world itself held its breath. Then came the sound chains dragging through water, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. Some swore they heard footsteps, others claimed it was just the current. But when dawn broke, only Crane remained. His men were gone, their bedrolls flattened, their rifles sinking beneath the mud. Elias Crane never spoke of what happened that night. When he finally emerged from the swamp weeks later, his face was pale, his coat shredded, and his eyes hollow, as if something had looked back at him and taken what it wanted. He carried no trophies, no proof, only silence, and those who saw him ride away swore he left a trail of water behind him, though it had not rained in days. The swamp had taken its payment once again. For every man who entered, another piece of Belle Rive's past was claimed. The hunters thought they had entered a wilderness. In truth, they had entered a graveyard, one that still remembered the sound of chains and the man who had once broken them. By the time Elias Crane reached the heart of the swamp, he was no longer a man on a mission. He was a shadow of himself, hollow in truth, and not just in name. Days without sleep had carved his face into something skeletal. His boots were lost to the mire, his rifle rusted in his grip, and the sound of his own breathing was the only company that remained. The swamp had swallowed his men, his hounds, his courage. Yet still he pressed forward, driven by something he could not name: duty, vengeance, or perhaps the need to prove that he could conquer what no other man dared to face. The air had turned heavy, almost solid, and the water steamed beneath a sky that refused to show the sun. Every tree appeared alive, their roots knotted like muscles, their limbs stretching toward him as though reaching to pull him under. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, not sharp or sudden, but deep, like the growl of something ancient. Then came the faint flicker of light through the fog fire, dancing orange and low, too deliberate to be natural. Crane followed it, each step sinking deeper into the black mud until he reached the clearing. What he found there was something between a nightmare and revelation. The clearing was ringed by broken chains, half buried in the muck, their metal corroded but still gleaming faintly in the glow. In the center burned a small fire, though no dry wood lay nearby to feed it. And standing beside it, still as the trees themselves, was a figure. The shape was unmistakable, a man, tall and broad, his body streaked with ash and water. The light caught the faint outline of scars across his chest, and for a moment Crane felt the earth tilt beneath him. What happened next was never written, and perhaps it never could be. Witnesses claimed they heard gunfire echo through the swamp that night, followed by screams that were not entirely human. Some said the fire flared high enough to light the treetops, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Others swore they saw two figures locked together in the dark, wrestling not for life or death but for something greater, as if one fought to destroy and the other to redeem. When the storm finally broke, lightning tore across the sky, splitting the cypress above the clearing. Rain poured in torrents, turning the ground into a churning sea of mud. Somewhere in that chaos, both men fell, their bodies dragged down into the mire. The swamp shook with thunder, and the fire hissed and died. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The clearing was empty. Only the broken chains remained, glinting faintly in the morning light. A single revolver lay beside them, its barrel buried halfway in the mud. A set of footprints led away from the scene, one set only, deep and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of two men. The people who found the site never agreed on what they saw next. Some said it was Crane who emerged from the bayou that morning, silent and haunted, his skin pale as ash. Others swore it was Gabriel, wearing another man's face, his eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. Whoever it was, the survivor did not speak. He simply walked north, leaving the swamp behind him, each step echoing with the sound of chains dragging through unseen water. The truth was lost to the mud that swallowed their struggle. The swamp had rendered its judgment, as it always did, not through words, but through silence. One man rose again, the other was claimed, and Belle Rive's curse deepened. Whether Gabriel lived or died no longer mattered. What mattered was that the land still breathed his story, and that somewhere in the mist, vengeance still walked on 2 feet. In the humid stillness of early summer, when the air at Belle Rive felt thick enough to drown in, a man appeared at the plantation gate. He came on foot, his coat torn and darkened with what looked like dried blood, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. The guards at the gate hesitated to question him. Something in his presence demanded silence. He gave no name. Only a letter of introduction written in Colonel Wildermore's own hand. The ink, shaky and uneven. The colonel read it twice before sending for the foreman and announcing that the plantation had found its new overseer. The man spoke little, answered no questions, and wasted no time. Within hours he was walking the rows, inspecting the ruined fields, giving orders in a low, gravelly voice. The workers obeyed out of instinct, not understanding why their hands trembled as he passed. He moved with the certainty of someone who had known these lands before, as if every path and fence post had been carved into his memory long ago. The colonel watched him from the veranda that evening, saying nothing, though Eveline Wildermore, pale and hollow-eyed, whispered that she recognized him, not his face, but the way he carried himself. The overseer never slept in the main quarters. He took the old cabin near the mill, the one that had belonged to Travis Crow before his death. At night, a faint light flickered through its cracked windows, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and rain, though no fire burned nearby. Those who passed by claimed they heard the sound of chains shifting on the floor, and once, when lightning struck across the river, someone swore they saw a reflection in the window, a face not of flesh, but of burnished steel and shadow. The slaves began to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. They said it was Gabriel who had returned, that he had found a way to walk among the living again. They said the swamp had let him go, but not unchanged. He had taken the overseer's body, worn it like a coat, and returned to finish what had been started. Others believed it was something far worse, not Gabriel himself, but the spirit that had consumed him, wearing a man's skin as a disguise. Whatever truth lay beneath the whispers, the result was the same. The fields grew quieter, the songs ceased, and the old fear that had once ruled Belle Rive began to turn inward. The new overseer never raised his voice, never used the whip, and never took pleasure in cruelty. Yet his silence was heavier than violence. When he passed, even the wind seemed to retreat. He carried with him an aura that made the bravest men falter and the cruelest men look away. The dogs refused to go near him. The horses reared when he approached. The colonel, once so sure of his dominance, began to avoid his own fields. Weeks passed, and the plantation began to change in ways no one could explain. The cane grew faster, but its color darkened to a strange, rust-like hue. The air around the mill thickened with an odor of iron. The workers said they heard whispers coming from the vats where sugar boiled, voices that rose with the steam and vanished as quickly as they came. Every night, the overseer walked the perimeter of the fields, carrying no lantern, as if he could see through the dark. Then, one morning, a worker found something buried in the soil near the edge of the property. A rusted chain, broken clean at the center, still wet as though it had just been pulled from water. The man who found it quit that very day, walking north without looking back. Others followed. Only those too weak or too terrified remained. By the time the colonel realized what was happening, it was too late. His plantation was alive again, but not in the way he had hoped. The harvest returned, but the sugar tasted bitter, metallic, corrupted by something unseen. The overseer never aged, never smiled, and never spoke of his past. And though he worked faithfully by the colonel's command, the man who once ruled Belle Rive began to feel like a guest in his own house. When lightning split the sky above the cane that season, the slaves whispered the name that had never truly died. Gabriel had returned. Whether it was his flesh, his spirit, or his curse, no one could say. But every time thunder rolled across the bayou, the colonel could swear it sounded like footsteps, slow, steady, and coming closer. By late summer, Belle Rive had begun to stir again, as if the land itself were waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The cane grew tall and thick, its green tips rustling in the breeze that rolled off the river. The mill fires burned once more, smoke curling into the sky in slow, deliberate spirals. To any stranger passing by, it might have looked as though the plantation had recovered, as though the storms, the deaths, and the whispers were nothing but a bad season. But for those who lived within its boundaries, it was clear that something beneath the surface had gone terribly wrong. The new overseer ran the fields with a precision that bordered on supernatural. The workers obeyed without protest, not from fear, but from something deeper, a wordless understanding that resistance was pointless. Under his watch, the harvest returned to abundance. Yet with each passing week, fewer hands were left to reap it. Men disappeared without trace, their cabins found empty at dawn, their tools still laid neatly by the door. The colonel ordered searches through the marshes, but no bodies were ever recovered. Only the earth seemed disturbed patches of soil freshly turned, as if something had been buried there and then forgotten. The colonel told himself it was desertion. He blamed thieves, swamp fever, anything that would allow him to hold on to reason. But even he could not ignore the silence that now ruled the fields. Where there had once been song, there was only the whisper of cane swaying in the heat, moving in unnatural rhythm, like breath drawn through unseen lungs. He began to notice strange patterns, footprints that led nowhere, shadows that clung to the edges of daylight. At night, from his bedroom window, he swore he could see figures moving in the distance, walking among the fields long after the work had ended. The overseer, meanwhile, was tireless. He worked from dawn until dusk, inspecting every row, every cart, every bundle of cane. No one ever saw him eat. No one ever saw him sleep. He seemed to belong to the landscape, more specter than man, his coat always dark with the damp of the fields. The dogs would not approach him, and the horses refused to cross his path. His presence was so absolute that even the colonel, once proud and commanding, found himself avoiding eye contact. It was as if the master had become the servant of his own creation. Eveline Wildermore, fragile and pale, refused to enter the fields entirely. She said the air there was wrong, too still, too aware. She claimed to hear breathing beneath the ground, as though the soil remembered what had been buried within it. Her husband dismissed her words at first, but the longer the overseer stayed, the more her fear became his own. He began hearing things too, faint screams carried on the wind, echoing through the corridors at night, rising and fading like the rhythm of the old mill wheels. When he went to investigate, there was nothing. Only silence, thick and suffocating, the kind that makes the skin crawl with memory. Soon the colonel's health began to fail. He stopped eating, claiming that everything tasted of ash. He paced the house at night, clutching a pistol, certain that someone or something was watching from the fields. The walls creaked with the sound of footsteps where no one walked. The mirrors fogged in rooms without heat. The servants left, one after another, until only the colonel, his wife, and the overseer remained. The sugar harvest that year was the richest Belle Rive had ever known, yet the profit meant nothing. The barrels filled with sweet gold were never shipped. They sat stacked in the storehouse, untouched, their contents slowly hardening into black tar. The colonel never asked why. He no longer cared about the business of sugar. His thoughts had turned inward, consumed by a truth he could not admit, that the land was reclaiming its debt, one life at a time. By autumn, the plantation no longer needed whips, chains, or laws. It was governed by something unseen, something older and crueler than man. The overseer continued his rounds, his figure cutting through the mist like a blade, and the colonel watched from the veranda, trembling. He understood now that Belle Rive was alive, and that the price of its rebirth was blood. The overseer was its keeper, its executioner, and perhaps its ghost. And when the colonel finally closed his eyes at night, he could no longer tell whether the screams that filled his dreams came from the fields outside or from the house itself. By the end of that cursed year, Belle Rive was no longer a plantation. It was a mausoleum pretending to breathe, a monument built from guilt and silence. The air around the great house thickened until it felt alive, pulsing with the weight of something unseen. Windows no longer reflected light. The candles burned lower each night, as if the darkness itself were feeding on the flame. And inside those suffocating walls, Eveline Wildermore began her slow descent into madness. She had once been the quiet center of the estate, elegant, soft-spoken, the picture of Southern grace. But after the fires, after her child's death, and after the arrival of the new overseer, something inside her began to fracture. The servants who remained said they heard her pacing the halls long after midnight, whispering prayers that began as scripture but ended in nonsense. Her once immaculate dresses hung loose, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. She kept her shutters closed during the day and lit every lamp at night, though no amount of light seemed to comfort her. In her private journals, she wrote of the figure she called the Watcher. At first, she described him vaguely, a tall man moving through the fog, a shadow standing beneath her window. But with each entry, her descriptions grew more detailed, more personal. She wrote that the overseer's reflection had no eyes. She had seen it in the parlor mirror when he passed behind her. His face appeared as it always did, stern and calm, but his eyes were nothing hollow sockets filled with lightless water. She fainted that day. And when she awoke, the mirror had cracked from corner to corner, as though the glass itself had recoiled from what it had seen. The colonel refused to believe her. He called it grief, hysteria, the consequence of too much solitude. Yet, even he began to notice the strangeness. The overseer cast no shadow in the lamplight. His boots left no trace in the mud after rain. He stood at the edge of the fields every evening, perfectly still, staring toward the swamp. Sometimes he would remain there until dawn, his coat glistening as though freshly soaked, though no storm had passed. Eveline grew certain of what she already feared. The man in their service was not living. She began to hear Gabriel's name carried on the wind that swept through the house, whispered between the walls when no one else was near. In her final coherent journal entry, written with a trembling hand, she confessed that the curse had taken root within their home. "He killed the overseer and became the master's curse," she wrote. "He wears death as a mask, and the mask has forgotten the man beneath it." After that night, she was rarely seen. The servants said she refused to eat, claiming the food was ash. Others swore they saw her talking to empty rooms, answering voices that no one else could hear. The colonel barred her windows and locked her in for her own safety, but the house itself seemed to conspire against him. Doors opened on their own. The sound of chains dragged across the floors at night. The scent of wet earth crept up from the cellar, where no water should have been. One morning, a maid found Eveline's writing desk overturned and her journals scattered. The ink had smeared across the floorboards, shaped like handprints pressed in blood. Her final entry, barely legible, read only, "He is here. The curse wears his face." After that, Eveline Wildermore's voice was never heard again. Some said she wandered into the fields, drawn toward the figure she had written about. Others claimed she remained within the house, buried alive by the darkness she feared. But the truth, like everything else at Belle Rive, was swallowed by the night. The house itself changed after her disappearance. The walls groaned, the floorboards warped, mirrors were covered with cloth, and no one dared remove them. Those who passed by after sundown said the windows glowed faintly from within, as though the house still held its mistress, pacing the halls she could never leave. Belle Rive had become the house of night, and within it, the curse had found a home. By the time the final fire came, Belle Rive was already half dead. The grand plantation that had once stood as a monument to wealth and power now sagged beneath the weight of decay. The fields that once shimmered with sugarcane now bowed under clouds of black flies. The house stood hollow and swollen with humidity, its walls streaked with mold, its shutters hanging like broken eyelids. Every night the air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of rain that never came. And through it all, the overseer kept his silent watch, a sentinel in a land that no longer belonged to men. Colonel Bartholomew Wildermore had become a ghost long before the flames arrived. His fortune was gone, his name reduced to whispers, his wife vanished without burial or prayer. He wandered the halls barefoot, muttering to himself, pistol always within reach. Servants found him sleeping on the floor near the hearth, as if afraid of what might stand over him in bed. He no longer spoke to the overseer, yet the man still appeared each morning, wordless, waiting for orders that never came. The plantation continued to function in eerie rhythm, though no one could say who still worked the fields. Some swore they saw shapes moving among the cane at dusk, not men, but shadows that glistened as if wet with mud. The final days came quietly. There was no storm, no thunder, no spark of rebellion. The first fire began in the mill. Born from nothing visible, witnesses later claimed the air itself caught flame, that smoke rose from the ground before any torch was lit. Within minutes the fire spread across the estate, devouring everything with unnatural hunger. The workers who had remained fled toward the river, but the heat moved faster than their feet. The wind changed, carrying embers toward the house, and by the time the colonel realized what was happening, the roof was already glowing red. He ran through the corridors, shouting his wife's name, though she had long since vanished. He called for help, but no voice answered. The overseer stood in the doorway, silent, watching the fire climb the walls like vines. The colonel's shouts turned to pleas, then to curses, but the figure did not move. Some said he smiled before the ceiling gave way. Others claimed the flames parted around him, leaving his outline framed in smoke. But when the roof collapsed, both men disappeared in the roar of fire and ash. By dawn, nothing remained but blackened earth. The mansion had burned to its foundation, the mill to twisted iron, the cane fields to charred stubble. The parish record would later list the destruction as an act of God, a line preserved in the courthouse archives in neat handwriting that reeked of denial. But the people who lived along the river knew better. They said the fire was not from heaven but from the swamp that Gabriel had come home to finish what he began. Weeks later, scavengers who sifted through the ruins found no bones in the ash. Only metal survived. Fragments of chain, a rusted pistol, and a cracked mirror, buried near the place where the parlor once stood. In its surface, the reflection was warped, a smear of light and shadow that seemed to move when no one did. The land refused to grow for years afterward. Rain turned to steam before it touched the soil, and cattle refused to graze near the burned perimeter. The ruins of Bel Rive became a boundary locals avoided. Travelers claimed to hear music there, faint humming, the rhythm of work songs carried by the wind. At night, some said, a figure could be seen walking the edge of the property, his coat glistening as if soaked by rain that never fell. The people of Street, Helena Parish, learned not to speak his name after sundown, but the legend endured. It was whispered in fields, carved into trees, and passed from one generation to the next. In time, Bel Rive was reclaimed by the swamp. The cane fields turned to marsh, the chimneys sank into the mud, and the last traces of human habitation vanished beneath the vines. But on still nights, when the fog drifts low and the crickets fall silent, the people say the land still breathes. The air smells faintly of sugar and smoke, and the water ripples without wind. The curse did not die with the fire, it simply went home, back to the soil that had birthed it. The record books ended with the phrase, "destroyed by act of God." But the land itself tells another story. God had nothing to do with it. The judgment that consumed Bel Rive came not from heaven, but from the heart of the swamp, from a man who killed his overseer and became the master's curse. Time has buried much of Bel Rive beneath the slow pulse of the Louisiana earth. The swamp reclaimed what the fire left behind, swallowing the foundations in silt and silence. Yet, even after more than a century, the land refuses to rest. What was once a plantation of sugar and sorrow has become a wilderness of cypress and reeds, where the air still carries the scent of iron and smoke. And though the world beyond the bayou has changed, though cities have risen, maps redrawn, and empires forgotten, the name Gabriel endures. Historians have long argued whether he ever truly lived. Some claim he was a myth born of guilt, a symbol conjured by the enslaved to make sense of a cruelty so vast it defied language. Others insist that the record's scattered parish ledgers, eyewitness accounts, and a single, faded death notice prove his existence. Archaeologists who have combed through the ruins of Bel Rive report findings that only deepen the mystery. They describe iron fragments buried deep beneath layers of ash, shackles fused together by a heat so intense it bent the metal into strange, flowing shapes. The scientists say it was lightning. The locals say it was justice. What cannot be denied is the persistence of the legend. From Baton Rouge to the Mississippi Delta, stories of Gabriel the slave who killed his overseer and became the master's curse are still whispered in the language of reverence and fear. In every version, the details shift, but the core remains. A man betrayed, a fire that would not die, and a haunting that turned a plantation into sacred ground. Church sermons once warned of him as divine punishment. Bluesmen sang his name in secret verses. Folklorists who came searching for facts left with questions instead. In 1937, during a Works Progress Administration survey, a team uncovered what they called the lightning pit, a circular impression in the soil near where the main house once stood. Inside, they found fragments of charred bone, rusted chains, and melted glass. The report described it clinically, but one line in the margin hinted at something older. Metal appears to have been struck repeatedly, as though by many small fires. The sample was sent to Baton Rouge for study and never returned. Those who handled it claimed the metal was warm to the touch, even after decades underground. Today, the land where Belle Rive once stood is marked only by a rusted historical plaque, half sunken into the mud. It reads, "Site of Belle Rive Plantation. Destroyed by act of God, 1857. But the locals still avoid it after dark. Hunters say their dogs refuse to cross the property line. Travelers claim to hear the sound of chains rattling beneath the water. And when storms roll over the bayou, lightning strikes that same ground with uncanny precision, illuminating the trees in flashes of white fire as if something beneath the surface still remembers what was taken from it." Descendants of the Wildermore family speak of misfortune that followed them long after the fire, illnesses without cause, fortunes lost overnight, and homes where mirrors shattered for no reason. Some moved north to escape the name, but the shadow of Belle Rive lingered like the echo of a song that refused to fade. For the descendants of the enslaved, the story became something else, not a warning, but a memory. They told their children that Gabriel's defiance was proof that even in bondage, the soul could rise. In the end, the question of Gabriel's existence matters less than the truth his story carries. Whether he was a man of flesh or a spirit born from vengeance, his legacy endures because it speaks to something eternal, the refusal of the human spirit to remain chained. The legend of Belle Rive is more than a ghost story. It is a reckoning written in blood, fire, and earth. And so the narration closes, not with certainty, but with reminder. Whether man or myth, Gabriel's story lives on because it must. The ruins may have sunk, the records may have burned, but the truth still breathes through the soil and the storm. Some chains break, others burn, and those that burn leave scars the world will never forget.